Hey everybody. For this video, I want to talk a little bit about our first essay, the narrative essay, and I'm also going to talk just very briefly about the Malcolm X reading that I've given you for homework. Narrative essay. As you know, you might have written an essay like this before, maybe not. It's a little bit different than like a persuasive essay or something like that. If we look at it, like narrative is like a story, right? And an essay is something that's trying to make like an argument or convince you of something. So this essay is kind of combining those two things. What we're going to be doing is telling a personal story that is supposed to kind of convince the reader of something. It's supposed to send like a specific message that the story is supposed to be like the evidence or like the way that you're proving your message is by telling this personal story. So the first thing, since it's personal, we will be using the word I, right? I know that there's been a ban on using the word I, that it's been a criminal offense to use the word I in an essay, but we're gonna get rid of that. We're gonna have to do that. And the reason that I'm going to talk about the Malcolm X essay in this video as well is because that essay is kind of an example of a narrative. And it's kind of a model, in a way, kind of a model for what we're going to be doing. So first, I just want to go real quick through this narrative essay assignment sheet. And make sure that you've read that. If you haven't done so, I would pause this video and go read that right now. You can find it under the tab. I created a new tab on the side that says assignment sheets. So I'm going to keep all of the stuff for all of our essays will go there, so you can find the instructions for the narrative essay right there right now. It's also under week 2. Read through this. I try to explain it as best I can. Let me say, okay, 3 things with doing this narrative essay that I'm requiring, basically, that are going to be really important. Maybe 4. Setting, dialogue, and a message. And I guess the other one would be like details, but that's kind of similar to setting. So setting and details, right, and dialogue, those are all kind of like storytelling elements. Those are things that we include when we tell stories, right? That's another thing. I want you to kind of think of this, the way to write this is like the way you would tell a story to a friend, right? If you were trying to make a point to them and you were to tell a story, you can kind of view this that way. So those are a few things that we need to have in this essay. And I'll talk a little more and I'll answer some questions about the best way to include them in the coming weeks. The message is something that I'm kind of giving you what the message is going to be. The kind of message for your paper is for this narrative essay is going to be that language is maybe more important than people think. Not that it's the single most important thing in the entire world, right? Not that it controls everything about our lives or anything like that, but just that it's more important than people think. How do we know what people think? Well, I would ask you just to think about like what your peers and people like who are starting out in college. Like, what are their general views on language? I think generally when I ask students at the beginning of the semester like how important language is, their response is like not very, right? They'll say like, well, it's just words, it's just things that you say, whatever actions are more important, stuff like that. So taking that as kind of the starting point, we're trying to show somebody coming from that point of view that language is maybe at least kind of important, at least somewhat important. So that's going to be the message of the narrative essay, right? So the rest of your job is going to be to come up with some kind of personal story that you can tell that kind of shows the audience this. So to help you do this, I gave you some suggested topics. And I'm going to try to throw up a picture of the narrative essay assignment sheet here. So I want to talk about the first one right now. It says unfair treatment. Tell a story that shows how you or someone else was treated unfairly because of how they talk or what language they speak. So each of these suggested topics is going to link up with an essay that we're going to read. The essays that I'm going to give you for homework and that I'm going to have you read during this unit are all going to be geared towards helping you write this narrative essay. So, for instance, this first one with unfair treatment, that one I think links up nicely with the Vershawn Young essay with should writers use their own English? Because that one is all about speaking in dialect and how, standard English is kind of used to like discriminate against people or like is like a gatekeeping mechanism for certain jobs or like getting to certain levels of society in terms of having high-paying jobs and things like that. So we have that one, unfair treatment, like how people talk being treated unfairly. So any story that you had about you or someone else, or just like even if you saw somebody else. That's another thing about this. It doesn't necessarily have to be something that happened to like you personally. It could be something that like you saw happen to someone else, or even something you heard about on the news or whatever. So any story about someone, getting treated differently because, they have an accent or they speak a different language or encountering this kind of attitude that like, oh, if you don't speak perfect English, like, you must be dumb or something like that. Any kind of story like that could fit in with this one. And then we'll as we read these other essays, I'll talk more about the other suggested topics that I have here. So we'll talk more about that later. And then I just want to go down to the requirements here. So as you can see, this is going to be at least 3 pages, 3 full pages, I would emphasize, not 2.5. You want to be down to the bottom of that 3rd page. So that's going to be the minimum length here, double space, Times New Roman, all of those things for the font and everything. And then we have the due dates at the bottom. We have a rough draft due October 14th, and the final one is going to be on the 23rd. So I'll give you a lot more information about, how to do the rough draft and everything as we get closer to those dates. But yeah, that's kind of the basics of the narrative essay. I will talk a lot more about this, but I just want to introduce it right now. Okay, now I want to move to this Malcolm X essay. So this essay is called Coming to an Awareness of Language. So we can see this essay, if I had to think of like what the message is for this essay, I think it's kind of similar to what I'm asking you to do for your narrative essay. So if I had to pick like one sentence that kind of explains the message here, it'd be the last sentence of the whole thing, in fact, the very last sentence. He says, in fact, up to then, I had never been so truly free in my life. So obviously this essay, it's about, him being in jail and being like kind of like illiterate sort of, right? He can like kind of read, but not really. He doesn't know that many words. He has a lot of trouble with handwriting and stuff. And he tells us a story about how as he started when he, because he's in prison and there's not much else he can do, as he starts reading and practicing his handwriting and then he starts writing people letters and stuff, how it kind of opens up like a whole new world for him. And like he says, makes him feel freer than he's ever been, even though, he's in jail, right? So how could he feel free if he's in jail? And it has to do with these discoveries that he's making about like reading and writing and all that stuff. I don't know, maybe that sounds a little bit corny, but I think there's something to it, right? Especially if you imagine being confined in that way. And I don't know, maybe it's kind of has a message for us being in quarantine and stuff like that about how to keep your mind free in a way, even if physically you're not. It's kind of scary to think about. So that is kind of his message, right? And I think that message shows us how language, like being important, right? Maybe more important than you thought. So in that way, I think the message of this essay is kind of similar to what I'm asking us to do. A couple other things I want to point out here. Right at the very beginning, I'm looking at, this is like the 2nd sentence, right at the beginning. He says, I soon began writing to people I had known in the hustling world, such as Sammy the Pimp, John Hughes, the gambling house owner, the thief Jump Steady, and several dope peddlers. Why does he give us the names of these people? He could have just said, I wrote letters to some people I knew, or some of my friends, or whatever, right? But instead, he gives us the actual names. And I think we would all agree that it's better to get the names. It's more interesting, right? And this is what I mean when I talk about like details for when we're writing this essay. You want to be as specific as you can. It makes it more interesting to give us the actual names of people, the actual places, instead of just saying like, oh, I went to the store. Well, like, what store did you go to? Was it a Wawa? Was it a Target? Like, what was it? So I think there's a good example there of how like giving extra details can really help to kind of pull the reader into the story and like make it more relatable. And that's one of the big things here, right? On your homework for this, I asked, is this more effective as a narrative than it would be as a persuasive essay? And I think that it is. Because I think that telling it as a story has a way of pulling the reader in, like I said, making it relatable and helping them to kind of like sympathize and feel everything that's going on, and it maybe makes us like more interested, more engaged, and ultimately more likely to accept his argument about the like power of language or the importance of language. So I think there's good reason to like do this kind of writing. I think it can achieve something that a persuasive essay can't necessarily achieve. One thing that I would criticize about this essay, I do wish that there was a little more dialogue. That's something I'm requiring for us. For instance, on the 2nd page, he's talking about how one of the things that made him realize like the importance of language was when he encounters this guy Bimby when he's in Charlestown prison. He says here on the bottom of the second page, Bimby had always taken charge of any conversation he was in. I had tried to emulate him. That's a moment whenever I read this essay where I'm like, I would like to see some dialogue there, right? He's saying this guy Bimby was a great speaker or something and could like command the room and things like that. It would be cool to get an example. It's always better in a narrative essay when you find yourself, if you find yourself like explaining what someone said, like if you're writing, my dad yelled at me for 10 minutes, it's always better to give us some of the direct dialogue than to explain what someone said. This is kind of, you might have heard the sort of writing, like common saying, show, don't tell. I think that's kind of how this works for the narrative essays. Like, if you're explaining what somebody said to you, just give us the dialogue directly. And I think that'll always make it like more interesting and engaging and all those things that we talked about. Okay, I think that's most of what I have here. Oh, maybe I should just remark how cool this essay is and how kind of crazy it is that he talks about like copying the entire dictionary. Kind of insane to think about that, right? So just like that always sticks out to me. Oh, one other thing I want to emphasize is some of the words that he uses to describe the way that language or like his experience with like becoming better at reading and writing, some of like the emotions it brought out in him. So I'm looking at the last page. He uses the word proud, he uses the word fascinated, and then the last sentence he uses the word free. So I think those all kind of contribute to like the message he's trying to send to is like how language, like learning more about it and becoming more interested in reading and writing and stuff, how it can be also kind of like a positive psychological thing, that it can help us to feel some positive things that we might not have otherwise, especially if we're, trapped in one place or something like that, like he was when he was in prison. So yeah, but I just wanted us to read this as kind of an example of what we're going to be doing. This is a narrative essay, right? This Malcolm X essay is a narrative essay. So it's the kind of thing that we're going to be doing. So like I asked you in the homework, I think it makes sense for us to kind of think about like, what are some of the things that make this a narrative essay? And I would say, what are some of the things that make it a good narrative essay? And also, how could it be better? So let's have all of that in mind as we start to think about writing our own narrative essays. Okay, I think that's all for this video. See you soon.